I'm fully aware that this is not the most exciting class or the most exciting lecture topic, but I think it's really important to understand the state of youth crime in Canada. So we do need to take a look at crime trends and see what has been happening over the last 30, 40 years in terms of the rate of offending, the severity of offending amongst youth in Canada. Criminology is not a natural science, so rarely do we ever get to have core facts that are universally true. But one of these core facts is the age crime curve, which depicts at the aggregate level the number of crimes committed per 100,000 people at each year of age. So what this age crime curve shows is that at around age 15, 16, 17, we see the rate of offending within the general population peak. So the highest rate of offending is when individuals are around 16 or 17 years old, and then we see a swift decline thereafter. This does not mean that youth account for more crime than adults. In fact, adults are actually account for maybe like 75, 80% of all crime. But that's because there are more adults than teenagers. All this age crime curve means is that at age 16, we're much more likely to see a population of 16-year-olds include individuals that engage in crime compared to if we were looking at a population of 20-year-olds or a population of 30-year-olds. Another critical point is that not all offenders follow the age crime curve. So remember that the age crime curve describes an aggregate trajectory. Recall from a couple of weeks ago when we talked about Terry Moffat's work especially, and she distinguished between AL and LCP offending as two different age crime curves, that most individuals are showing that AL pattern that does resemble kind of the aggregate age crime curve, but she also said there was a small group of individuals associated with life course persistent offending. And we find that in Canada, or at least in British Columbia, amongst serious and violent youth, this is also true. There are multiple different patterns or trajectories of offending over time. You can see in the lower graph here showing the colored trajectories between ages 12 to 23, and on the y-axis you can see the number of different convictions. You can see different patterns of conviction trajectories for a sample of formerly incarcerated boys and girls. Some of these individuals do kind of follow the age crime curve, where some individuals show more of a persistent pattern of offending over time. So the key here is that not all individuals follow that age crime curve. It's an aggregate description, but it doesn't mean that all individuals follow that same pattern. When it comes to youth crime rates in Canada, we can see that especially since the late 1980s, early 1990s, total youth crime in Canada has been dropping, and this is also true of property crimes and to maybe a lesser extent violent crimes. Part of the reason why we don't see as big of a decline in violent crimes on this particular graph compared to total crimes or property crimes, because violent crime isn't that prevalent to begin with, so it's more difficult on this scale to see an actual big decline in violent crime. In the 1990s, James DiLeo developed this idea that there was the youth super predator, and that by the mid-1990s, early 2000s, there were going to be tens of thousands of youth in the United States who were these quote-unquote psychopaths, murderers, callous and unemotional, gang involved, and they were going to be roaming the streets and crime would be out of control. And this was totally wrong. It was a complete fabrication, not a fabrication, but it was just wildly inaccurate and did a lot of harm to a lot of young kids who got labeled as these super predators. This was more so in the United States, but because Canada tends to spend a lot of time focusing on media in the United States, these ideas or opinions were somewhat adopted in Canada as well, and we thought that we needed to have this really get tough on crime approach to curb the youth super predator. In reality, we did not see an increase in youth crime. In fact, we have seen over the last several decades declines in the youth crime rate. I first started interviewing kids in the youth custody centers throughout British Columbia around 2008, 2009. And at that time, in the Burnaby Youth Custody Center, there were about 110, 120 residents. Today, there's like 10, 13. So we've seen a massive decline in the rate of youth being sentenced to custody in British Columbia. Some might suggest, well, maybe the youth crime rate is going down, but what about more serious offenses? Is it possible that youth are committing more serious crimes? Or even, is it possible that youth are committing really serious crimes and we're placing them in custody for a long period of time, and that has been effective in reducing the crime rate? So by incarcerating kids for a longer period of time, we've managed to reduce the crime rate. So one way of evaluating this is looking at the crime severity index, which basically calculates the average length of time an individual would receive had they committed a particular crime type. What we can